There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a friend beside you on a worn-out sofa. You don't recognize them as tectonic plates shifting deep beneath the surface of your world. You think it's just another evening, another shared silence, another breath drawn in the same small space. It is only later, when you look back from the landscape of the after, that you see the precise, hairline fracture where everything you thought you knew broke apart and began to reform itself into something new, something terrifying, something true. For me, that moment was not a grand declaration or a dramatic event. It was a question whispered into the blue-gray light of a television screen, a question so simple and so seismic it threatened to undo me entirely. The question itself was nothing spectacular. It was raw, a little clumsy, and utterly disarming in its directness. Julian, who had been a fixed point in my universe for the better part of a decade, shifted his weight on the couch, the worn leather groaning in protest. His head had been resting on my shoulder for the past hour as some forgettable action movie flickered and boomed before us, a comfortable, established ritual that had taken root in the barren soil of his recent heartbreak. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, not much more than a murmur against the fabric of my shirt. He didn't lift his head. He didn't look at me. The words were just there, suddenly occupying the air between us, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the projector's beam. "What gets you off?" My entire body went still. It was as if every function, every involuntary process, had been put on an immediate and indefinite hold. Breathing felt like a conscious and difficult choice. The rhythmic beat of my heart, which had been a steady, lulling drum against Julian's ear, suddenly felt like a frantic, panicked bird trapped against my ribs. The question hung there, shimmering with unspoken implications. It wasn't asked with a leer, not with the casual bravado he might have used with a girl at a bar in our college days. It was quiet, serious, and laced with a genuine, unnerving curiosity. It was the question of a cartographer asking for the coordinates to an undiscovered country, a place he suspected existed but had never seen a map of. And the country he was asking about was me. My silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second of on-screen explosions. I could feel his stillness against me, the way his own breathing had shallowed, waiting for an answer. He was giving me an out, I knew. I could laugh it off, make a joke, deflect with some generic, meaningless response. I could pretend I hadn't heard him. But I also knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that this was not a casual inquiry. This was a door, creaked open just an inch, and how I answered would either slam it shut forever or invite him to step across the threshold. Before I could even begin to assemble a response, before I could decide which path to take, he spoke again, his voice even softer this time, a thread of sound weaving through the cinematic chaos. "No, I mean it, Leo. Tell me. I want to know." And then came the part that truly broke me open. "Describe it. For me. Just talk." He wanted notes. He wanted a blueprint. He wanted to sit in the dark and listen to me confess the secret architecture of my own desire, and I knew, with the kind of gut-deep instinct that bypasses all rational thought, that I was going to give it to him. To understand the sheer magnitude of that moment, you have to understand the foundation upon which our friendship was built. Julian and I were a study in complementary opposites, a phenomenon we discovered our sophomore year of college when the housing lottery gods had seen fit to make us roommates. He was the sun, and I was the planet that had settled into a quiet, stable orbit around him. Julian was all kinetic energy, a whirlwind of easy smiles, restless limbs, and a social calendar that was a testament to his effortless charisma. He was a software engineering major, something that seemed at odds with his personality until you saw the intense, focused way he could lock onto a problem, the same way he could lock onto a person in a crowded room and make them feel like the only one there. He wasn't loud, not in an obnoxious way, but he radiated a kind of golden, magnetic warmth that drew people in. I, on the other hand, was a creature of shade and quiet observation. A photography student, I lived my life through a lens, finding comfort in framing the world, in capturing fleeting moments of light and emotion from a safe distance. I was perfectly content in the background, a silent chronicler of the life that swirled around me. Where Julian filled a room, I tended to find a corner of it to occupy, watching, listening, processing. Our dynamic should have been oil and water, but instead, it was something more like an anchor and a ship. He would pull me out into the bustling, brilliant sea of social interaction, and I would provide the steady, grounding force that kept him from being swept away by his own restless currents. He taught me how to exist in the world, and I taught him how to be still in it. Our friendship was an immediate and profound comfort to me. He never pushed me to be more like him, never seemed to judge my preference for a quiet evening with a book over a raucous party. He accepted my introversion as a simple fact of my being, the same way I accepted his need to constantly be in motion. He'd come back to our dorm room, buzzing with energy, and instead of dragging me out, he would collapse onto his bed and just talk, recounting his night, his classes, his frustrations with a line of code. And I would listen. I became the repository for the thoughts he couldn't articulate to anyone else, the quiet observer of the boy beneath the sunshine. It was in those quiet moments, in the hushed confessions about his family pressures or his anxieties about the future, that I first felt the tectonic shift inside myself. It wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was a slow, creeping continental drift, an incremental movement so gradual I barely noticed it until the landscape of my heart was irrevocably changed. It began as a deep, abiding affection, a fierce loyalty to this person who had so effortlessly made space for me in his life. But it deepened, colored by the intimacy of our late-night talks, the easy physical comfort that grew between us, a hand on a shoulder, leaning against each other while studying, the casual way he'd throw an arm around me in a moment of triumph. I started to notice things with the sharpened focus of my camera lens, the way a specific patch of sunlight would catch the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the exact cadence of his laughter when it was genuine and unforced. I fell in love with him the way you fall asleep, slowly, and then all at once. By senior year, it was a fundamental, undeniable truth of my existence, a truth I promptly and meticulously buried. I encased it in layers of self-preservation, building a fortress around it made of plausible deniability and the sheer, unadulterated terror of losing him. Our friendship was a sanctuary, a perfectly balanced ecosystem. To introduce the volatile, unpredictable element of my feelings felt like an act of wanton destruction. It would be like setting fire to the only home I'd ever truly felt I had. So I became an expert in hiding in plain sight. I listened to him talk about the girls he was dating, offering quiet, non-committal advice. I was the perfect, supportive friend. I remember one afternoon with painful clarity. He was getting ready for a date with Sarah, a girl from his economics class. He was standing in front of the cheap, full-length mirror we had propped against the wall, wrestling with a tie. He was frustrated, his movements jerky. "I don't get it, Leo," he'd said, turning to me. "It's like, I'm going through the motions. She's great. She's smart. She's funny. So why does it feel like I'm trying to solve a puzzle I don't have all the pieces for?" I'd just shrugged, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. "Maybe you're just nervous," I'd offered, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. He'd looked at me then, a long, searching look, and for a terrifying second, I thought he could see right through me, right down to the frantic, hopeful, miserable truth of it all. But then he'd just sighed, turned back to the mirror, and finally wrestled the tie into submission. He'd left, and I'd stayed, the silence of the room amplifying the ache of everything I couldn't say. That feeling became my constant companion, a low-grade fever that never quite broke. After graduation, we managed to stay in the same city, a small miracle I was endlessly grateful for. I found a small studio apartment and started a freelance photography business, scraping by on portraits, weddings, and the occasional art sale. Julian, predictably, was hired by a big tech consulting firm before the ink on his diploma was even dry. His job sent him flying across the country, sometimes across the world. He was living the life he was built for. New cities, new problems to solve, new people to charm. And yet, our friendship remained the one constant. He would call me from sterile hotel rooms in Omaha or Singapore, his voice tinny and distant, and tell me about his work, the loneliness of airport terminals, the strange feeling of living out of a suitcase. I was his tether to a place called home. And every time he came back to town, the first place he'd go, often before he even went to his own apartment, was mine. He'd show up at my door, exhausted and jet-lagged, drop his bags, and collapse onto my couch as if it were the only truly comfortable surface on the planet. And I would let him. I would make him tea, listen to his stories, and pretend that the frantic, joyful leap in my chest was just happiness at seeing my friend again. This was our normal, a carefully maintained equilibrium built over years of practice. I had my secret, and he had his freedom, and our friendship existed in the space between. I had resigned myself to this reality. The love I had for him was a part of me, like a vital organ, but one I had learned to live with in silence. I had accepted that my role was to be the quiet harbor, the safe place he could return to between voyages. I would be the observer, the keeper of his stories, the silent guardian of a love he would never know existed. I had made my peace with that, or so I had thought. The shift began, as so many profound changes do, not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding dissolution. Julian's relationship with Sarah, which had somehow survived college and blossomed into a long-distance affair, had been fraying for months. I knew this because Julian had been cataloging its decline in our phone calls. The conversations were less about her and more about the logistics of trying to see her, the strain of scheduling calls across time zones, the growing sense of obligation that had replaced the initial spark. It was a slow, painful erosion, and Julian, a man who liked to fix things, was frustrated by his inability to stop the inevitable tide. The end came on a rainy Thursday in November. My phone rang late, around 11. It was Julian, but not the Julian I was used to hearing. His voice, usually so full of energy even when he was tired, was hollowed out, a flat, empty monotone. He was at the airport, just landed from a 2-week stint in Chicago. "It's over," he said, without preamble. There was no emotion in the words, just a statement of fact. She called me while I was waiting to board. Said she couldn't do it anymore. The distance. Everything. "Jules, I'm so sorry," I said, my own voice feeling inadequate. "Yeah," he breathed, a sound like static over the line. "Me too." I guess a pause. I could hear the tinny, garbled announcement of a final boarding call in the background. "Hey, Leo, is it okay if I just come over? I don't think I can go back to my place right now. It's just so quiet." The word quiet coming from him was what did it. Julian didn't just tolerate noise. He created it, thrived in it. For him to fear quiet was like a fish fearing water. It was a sign of a deep and fundamental distress. "Of course," I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Don't even go to your apartment. Just come straight here. I'll leave the door unlocked." When he arrived an hour later, he looked like a ship that had been wrecked. The usual confident set of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a weary slump. His eyes, normally so bright, were dull and shadowed. He was still in his work clothes, a crisp shirt, now rumpled, and dark trousers, but he looked as though he'd been wearing them for days. He didn't say anything. He just walked in, dropped his carry-on by the door with a heavy thud, and stood in the middle of my small living room, looking utterly and completely lost. It was the first time I had ever seen him look fragile. I didn't press him. I didn't offer platitudes or ask for details. I just went to the kitchen and made him a cup of chamomile tea, the way I always did when he was stressed. I put the mug in his hands, and his fingers were cold. He wrapped them around the warmth of the ceramic, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam. We stood there in silence for a long time, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle patter of rain against the window pane. Finally, he looked up at me, and his eyes were glassy. "I don't even know if I'm sad," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Is that awful? I think I'm just tired. So fucking tired. Of trying. Of flying. Of pretending I'm okay with sleeping in a different bed every other night. I feel untethered, you know." I knew better than he could possibly imagine. I just nodded. He gestured vaguely at my couch. "You don't have to ask," I said softly. He crashed on the couch that night, and the next. He didn't go back to his own apartment for 3 days. He just existed in my space, a quiet, brooding presence. He slept a lot. When he was awake, we didn't talk about Sarah or the breakup. We watched movies, I cooked for him, and we fell into a comfortable, domestic silence. It felt different from his usual post-trip visits. Before, he was a visitor, a welcome guest. Now, It felt like he was a part of the apartment's ecosystem, as much a fixture as my collection of photography books or the ficus tree in the corner. He was healing, I thought. He was using my home, my presence, as a dry dock to repair himself after the storm. And I was more than willing to be that for him. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. But then, the nature of the healing began to change. The lines, which I had so carefully drawn and maintained for years, started to blur. The catalyst of the breakup had opened a door in him, a need for a kind of comfort that our friendship, in its previous form, had not accounted for. And so, the ritual began. It started subtly. It was a Friday night, about 2 weeks after the breakup. He'd been back at his own place for a while, and things were seemingly returning to normal. He came over for our customary movie night. We were on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, watching some moody black and white film I'd picked out. Halfway through, he stretched, yawned, and then just settled. He didn't ask. He just shifted, rested his head on my shoulder, and closed his eyes. My body went rigid. This was new territory. He'd fallen asleep on me before, passed out from jet lag or too much beer in college. But this was different. This was a conscious choice. He wasn't asleep. His breathing was still the rhythm of wakefulness. He was just resting on me. I sat there, ramrod straight, for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending in my body screamingly aware of the weight of his head, the warmth of his cheek through my shirt, the faint scent of his shampoo. I was terrified to move, to even breathe too deeply, for fear of breaking the spell. Eventually, my own tension must have become obvious. Is this okay? He murmured, his voice thick with what sounded like nascent sleep. Yeah, I managed to choke out, my own voice a strained whisper. It's fine. He hummed a little note of contentment and snuggled in closer, a completely unself-conscious movement that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated panic and longing through me. This was the beginning. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of a new, unspoken agreement. The couch became our space. Movie nights were no longer about the movies. They were about this. About him seeking a physical comfort that went beyond the platonic. He would arrive, looking worn down from a week of meetings and spreadsheets, and within minutes, he would have gravitated to my side, his head finding its now familiar place on my shoulder, his long legs stretched out, his foot sometimes resting on my ankle. I became a student of his exhaustion. I could read it in the slump of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. And I became the antidote. My presence, my stillness, my quiet apartment, it was his medicine. And the physical contact was the dosage. It was a sanctuary for him. But for me, it was a beautiful, exquisite form of torture. To have him so close, to feel the weight of him, to breathe in his scent, and to know that for him. This was about comfort, about finding a safe harbor, while for me, it was about love, a desperate, unspoken love. The plausible deniability was his, but the anxiety was all mine. Every time he leaned against me, a silent war raged within me. One part of me, the logical, self-preservationist part, screamed that I was misinterpreting everything, that I was projecting my own feelings onto his innocent need for friendship. The other part, the hopeful, foolish heart, whispered that this was more, that no one seeks this level of consistent, intimate physical contact with a friend unless there is something deeper at play. The ritual escalated. It moved from the couch to the threshold of my bedroom. He started staying over more often, even when he wasn't fresh off a plane. He'd claim it was too late to drive back, or that he had an early meeting on my side of town. He'd take the couch, but he'd fall asleep with the television on, and I would be the one to turn it off, to pull a blanket over him. I would stand there in the dark, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest, my heart aching with a tenderness so profound it felt like a physical wound. I was living in a state of perpetual, high-alert yearning. Then came the open door. It was after a particularly brutal trip to London. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, and when he showed up at my door, he looked like a ghost. He barely spoke, just handed me a small box of expensive tea as a gift, and then went to take a shower. I told him to take my bed, that I would take the couch. He argued, but he was too tired to put up a real fight. I heard the water shut off, and a few minutes later, he emerged, wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair damp and curling at the ends. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice barely audible. He walked into my bedroom and shut the door. I felt a familiar pang of disappointment, a feeling I immediately chided myself for. Of course he shut the door. What did I expect? I settled onto the couch, trying to read, but the words just swam in front of my eyes. About an hour later, I heard a faint creak. I looked up. The bedroom door was now ajar, a slice of darkness cutting through the dim light of the living room. My heart started hammering. It could be nothing. Maybe he was too warm. Maybe he was afraid of the silence he'd mentioned before. The plausible deniability was a fortress, but it was also a test, a question asked without words. I sat there for a long time, my book forgotten in my lap, just staring at that sliver of blackness. It felt like a dare. Finally, I got up. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were approaching a wild, easily startled animal. I pushed the door open a little further. "Jules," I whispered into the darkness. A rustle of sheets. "Can't sleep." His voice came back, thick and weary. "My brain won't shut off. All the time zones are having a party in my head." This was it. The next step. The next unspoken invitation. I walked into the room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The only light came from the street lamp outside my window, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I could see his shape under the covers, a restless lump. I sat down on the edge of the bed, being careful not to jostle him. The mattress dipped with my weight. "Tell me about it," I said softly. "The trip. Tell me something boring." And so he did. He talked about spreadsheets and quarterly reports and the blandness of corporate catering. He spoke in a low monotone, and as he talked, I could feel the tension slowly beginning to seep out of him. His movements under the covers stilled. His voice grew heavier, slower. After about 15 minutes, his words started to slur, and then they trailed off into silence. His breathing deepened, evening out into the steady rhythm of sleep. I should have left then. That was the logical, safe thing to do. Get up, go back to the couch, maintain the boundary. But I couldn't. I was pinned there by the sheer force of my own longing, by the profound peace that had settled in the room. I just sat there, watching him sleep, my hand resting on the duvet, inches from his shoulder. After another half an hour of this silent vigil, my own exhaustion began to catch up with me. My back ached from sitting so rigidly. Without making a conscious decision, I found myself swinging my legs up onto the bed and lying down on top of the covers, parallel to him, leaving a careful, chaste foot of space between our bodies. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling, listening to him breathe. It was the closest I had ever been to peace, to having what I wanted. This became the new ritual, the open door, my vigil by his bed, and eventually, the silent slide onto the mattress, keeping our safe, uncrossable distance, two separate islands in the same quiet sea, close enough to feel the tide, but never touching. We existed in this liminal space for months. It was a fragile, beautiful, and agonizing routine. He would come back from his travels, broken and tired. The door would be left ajar. I would come in, sit with him, and eventually lie down beside him, a silent guardian against his loneliness, a martyr to my own. I was so terrified of frightening him, of misreading the signs and shattering this delicate thing we had built. I told myself that this was enough. To be the person he turned to be allowed this strange, chaste intimacy, it was more than I had ever thought I would have. I was the keeper of his rest. I was the silent witness to his vulnerability. It had to be enough. And it was. Until the night he asked the question. That night was no different from any other. He had been back from a short trip to Seattle, and the familiar weariness was clinging to him like a second skin. We'd skipped the pretense of the bedroom door ritual and had gone straight to the couch, our default setting. The action movie was just background noise, a meaningless soundtrack to the real event, which was the slow, inevitable way he had slumped against me, his head finding my shoulder, his arm draped loosely over my stomach. The warmth of him seeped into my bones, a familiar, addictive heat. His breathing was deep and even against my neck. I thought he was asleep. I had allowed my own guard to drop, my body relaxing into his weight, my hand coming to rest on his arm in a gesture that felt both proprietary and terrifyingly natural. The house was quiet, the city outside was asleep, and in that small bubble of space on my couch, the world felt simple, whole. And then, from the depths of that supposed sleep, came the whisper. "What gets you off?" My carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The air, which had been warm and comfortable, was suddenly charged with a high-voltage current. I could feel the fine hairs on my arms stand up. His question wasn't the opening salvo I had been dreading for years, the one that would force a confession and likely end in ruin. It was something else entirely. It was an interrogation, but a gentle one. It was an act of profound curiosity. And as he added, "Describe it. For me. Just talk," I understood. He wasn't asking for a list of sexual acts. He was asking for the emotional truth behind them. He wanted the why, not the what. He was taking the unspoken intimacy we had cultivated in the dark and demanding that I give it a voice. My own voice, when I finally found it, was a ghost of its usual self, thin and shaky. "Why are you asking that?" I whispered to the flickering screen. He shifted, just slightly, pressing his face more firmly into the curve of my neck. I could feel the puff of his breath against my skin. "Because I watch you," he said, and the simple admission stole the air from my lungs. "I watch you all the time. You're so self-contained. You're like this locked room, and I feel like for months, I've just been rattling the doorknob, trying to get in. But you never open it. You just let me sleep on the porch." The metaphor was so painfully accurate it felt like he had reached into my chest and plucked it directly from my heart. "I want to know what it's like inside," he finished, his voice barely a murmur. "I want you to let me in." The fortress I had built around my heart, the one I had spent a decade reinforcing, crumbled to dust in that single moment. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a wave of something else, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. I took a breath, a deep, shuddering thing that was half sob, half sigh, and I began to talk. It's not about big things," I started, my voice low and halting. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, on the meaningless dance of light and shadow. "It's quiet things. It's safety. The feeling of being completely, utterly safe with someone. So safe that you don't have to pretend. You don't have to be on, you can just be broken, tired, whatever you are. And you know that the person next to you isn't going to run away. They're going to stay." I could feel him listening. It was more than just hearing the words. It was an active, intense absorption. I could feel it in the stillness of his body, the way all his restless energy had focused into a single point of concentration. "It's trust," I continued, the words coming more easily now, like a river that had finally broken through a dam. "It's knowing that someone sees all of you. Not just the parts you put on display, but the messy, complicated, scared parts that you keep hidden. And they don't just tolerate those parts. They value them. They see them as part of the whole. It's about being known. Really, truly known." I paused, my throat tight with emotion. I was laying myself bare, handing him the keys to every locked room inside me. I was describing him. I was describing us. I was describing the life I had been living in secret, in the quiet observation deck of my own heart. "It's the small things," I whispered, my voice growing thick. "It's the weight of a head on my shoulder." I felt him tense slightly at that, a flicker of acknowledgement. "It's the sound of someone else's breathing in a dark room. It's the unspoken promise in leaving a door open. It's feeling a hand on your arm and knowing, without a single word, that it means I'm here. You're not alone." It's not about the noise. It's about the silence. The beautiful, honest silence you can share with someone when you don't need words to explain anything. My confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. I had said it all. I had taken the most vulnerable part of myself and placed it in his hands. I braced myself for the fallout, for him to pull away, to laugh awkwardly, to say, "Oh, right," and pretend he hadn't just dismantled me with a simple question. I waited for the familiar chill of retreat, the sound of the door to my inner world being quietly closed and locked again. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he moved. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his head from my shoulder. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. He shifted on the couch until he was facing me, his knees bumping against mine. The movie still played, casting shifting patterns of light and dark across his face, but it was just noise now. The world had shrunk to the space between his eyes and mine. His expression was one I had never seen before. It was stripped of all its usual easygoing charm. It was raw, vulnerable, and intensely serious. It was the face of someone who had just been handed a map and was seeing, for the first time, that the treasure was not where he thought it would be. "Leo," he breathed, and my name on his lips sounded like a prayer. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at me, his gaze tracing the lines of my face as if he were trying to memorize them, or perhaps seeing them clearly for the very first time. And then he leaned in. It was the slowest, most hesitant movement I had ever witnessed from him. It was a question, asked in motion. Every inch he closed the distance between us was a new clause in a silent sentence. "Is this okay? Are you sure? Is this what you meant?" My heart was a riot in my chest, a deafening drumbeat that drowned out the movie, the city, everything. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch him come closer, this celestial body breaking from his orbit to collide with mine. I gave my answer in the only way I could. I didn't pull back. I didn't flinch. I just held his gaze, and in the final moment before his lips met mine, I closed my eyes. The kiss was not what I had imagined in 1,000 secret daydreams. It was not passionate or demanding. It was not a firework display. It was softer, quieter, and infinitely more profound. It was a confirmation. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty in a decade of unspoken words. His lips were tentative against mine, hesitant, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile. It was a kiss of pure, terrifying vulnerability. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was him, finally, stepping over the threshold, stepping into the room I had kept locked for him for so long. When he pulled back, it was only an inch. His forehead came to rest against mine. His eyes were still closed. "Oh," he whispered, a single, breathy syllable that held a universe of discovery. "So that's what it feels like." The aftermath was not the gentle dawn I might have hoped for, but a stark and confusing morning. I woke up on the couch alone. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes in the air, but the warmth of the light felt mocking. The apartment was silent, but it was not the peaceful, shared silence of the night before. It was an empty silence, a void where he should have been. The television was off. The popcorn bowl was gone, washed and placed in the drying rack. A single, folded piece of paper sat on the coffee table. My heart plummeted. I knew, even before I reached for it, that it was a retreat. His handwriting, usually a confident, sloping script, was tight and jerky. The note was short, brutal in its simplicity. "Leo, I'm sorry. I'm a mess. I need to think. Sorry." The word was a punch to the gut. Sorry for what? For kissing me? For asking? For making me believe, for one beautiful, fragile moment, that we were on the same page? And "I'm a mess." It was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, the perfect excuse to invalidate everything that had happened. He was positioning the kiss not as a mutual act of discovery, but as a symptom of his own confusion, his own emotional turmoil. He had taken the most honest moment of my life and reframed it as his mistake. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the dark withered into a cold, hard knot of hurt and anger. He hadn't just left. He had taken my confession with him and left an apology in its place. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. I existed in a state of suspended animation, constantly checking my phone, my heart leaping at every notification, only to have it crash back down when it wasn't him. I replayed the kiss, the conversation, over and over in my mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, with the obsessive focus of a detective examining a crime scene. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his eyes? Had I misinterpreted the tenderness of his touch? Had he just been using me as a temporary balm for his loneliness, a convenient and willing source of comfort, and had accidentally taken it one step too far? The thought was a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundation of our entire friendship. He was a ghost. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. It was a complete and total withdrawal, a radio silence more deafening than any argument could have been. He was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick, and I was on the other side, watching it go up, helpless to stop it. The rituals we had built, the couch, the open door, the quiet comfort, they all felt like a lie now, a prelude to a punchline I hadn't seen coming. My sanctuary had become a haunted house, every corner of my apartment filled with the memory of his presence and the gaping wound of his absence. My anger warred with a deep, aching sadness. I was furious at him for his cowardice, for making me vulnerable only to abandon me in the wreckage. But underneath the anger, I was just heartbroken. I had lost not only the possibility of a future, but the certainty of my past. I had lost my best friend. After a week of this agonizing silence, something inside me snapped. The hurt and sadness curdled into a cold, hard resolve. I could not let this be the end. I could not let our decade of friendship, our profound connection, be erased by a single, terrified note. He didn't get to light a fire and then just walk away while I was left to burn. He owed me more than that. He owed me an explanation. He owed me the truth, no matter how difficult it was. Armed with this grim determination, I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to see him. I had to force the confrontation he was so desperately trying to avoid. His apartment felt like foreign territory. In all our years of friendship, I had probably been there less than a dozen times. It was a nice place, modern and minimalist, but it had all the personality of a high-end hotel room. It was a place to store his things between trips, not a home. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my courage wavering. What if he wasn't there? What if he was, and he refused to open the door? I took a deep breath and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside, a pause, and then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, framed in the gap. He looked even worse than he had the night of the breakup. He was unshaven, his hair was a mess, and he was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants he'd had on 2 days ago. But the worst part was his eyes. They were hollow, haunted, and when they met mine, they were filled with a potent mixture of guilt and panic. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough croak. He didn't open the door any further. He was literally and metaphorically blocking my way. "Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my own voice colder and steadier than I felt. He flinched, but he didn't move. "This isn't a good time." "No, I don't think it is," I said, my patience gone. "But we're going to have this conversation, Julian. You don't get to do what you did and then just disappear. You don't get to ask me to tear myself open for you and then tell me you're sorry. What the hell are you sorry for? For kissing me? Or for running away like a coward the second it got real?" The accusation hit its mark. A flash of something, anger, shame, crossed his face. He finally opened the door and stepped back, a gesture of defeat. I walked into the sterile apartment, and the air was thick with tension. He didn't turn on a light, leaving us in the gloom of the late afternoon. He wouldn't look at me. He just stood by the window, his back to me, staring out at the city. "I don't know what to say," he mumbled, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Try the truth." I shot back, the hurt making my words sharper than I intended. "Try telling me what's going on in your head instead of leaving a cryptic, bullshit note on my coffee table." What was that, Julian? Was I just an experiment? A moment of post-breakup confusion? Was any of it real? He finally turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. "Of course it was real," he said, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. "That's the problem, Leo. Don't you see? It was too real." He scrubbed a hand over his face, pacing the small space between the window and his own ridiculously uncomfortable-looking couch. I don't know what's happening to me. For months, all I've wanted is to be near you. When I'm on the road, all I can think about is getting back to your apartment, to that couch. It's the only place I feel quiet. The only place my brain stops screaming at me. And I thought it was just comfort, friendship. I told myself it was just that you're my best friend, and I was lonely." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "But that night, when I asked you that question, I didn't even know why I was asking it. The words just came out. And then you started talking. You described everything. Everything I'd been feeling but didn't have a name for. Safety, trust, being known. And I realized, sitting there, listening to you, that it wasn't just comfort I wanted from you. It was everything. All of it. And when I kissed you," he trailed off, his throat working. "When I kissed you, it was like coming home. It was the first honest thing I think I've done in years. And it terrified me." His confession, so raw and painful, extinguished the last of my anger, leaving only a profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just lost. He was a man whose entire life had been built on a specific blueprint, and he had just discovered that his heart was drawn to a completely different architecture. "Why?" I asked softly, taking a step toward him. "Why did it terrify you?" "Because I don't know how to do this," he burst out, gesturing wildly with his hands. "This. Us. I've never. I've only ever been with women. My whole life, my whole identity, is built around that. My family, my friends. Everyone sees me one way. And this feeling, this thing with you, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit into the box I've built for my life. And I panicked. I woke up the next morning, and all I could feel was this overwhelming fear that I was going to ruin you. That I would mess us up, because I don't know what I'm doing. And I couldn't bear the thought of destroying the one good, stable thing in my life. Our friendship. He finally collapsed onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. He hadn't run away because he didn't care. He had run away because he cared too much. He was terrified of breaking the most precious thing he had. And in that moment, seeing him so utterly broken and afraid, my role became clear once again. The anger and hurt dissolved, replaced by the familiar, powerful instinct to be his anchor. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, leaving a small, respectful space between us. I didn't touch him. Not yet. I just waited for the storm to pass. The confrontation in Julian's sterile apartment had not been a resolution, but a demolition. It had leveled the walls of fear and misunderstanding that he had thrown up between us, leaving us exposed and raw in the rubble. But it was in that wreckage that we could finally begin to build something new, something honest. As his sobs subsided into shuddering breaths, I finally broke the silence, my voice gentle. "You think you're the only one who's scared?" I asked. He lifted his head from his hands, his face blotchy and his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like a lost child. "Julian," I said, my voice softening further, "I have been in love with you for 10 years. For a decade, I have been terrified, every single day, of saying or doing one wrong thing that would make you walk away. I built an entire fortress around my feelings to protect what we have. So don't you dare talk to me about being afraid of ruining our friendship. I've been living in that fear for as long as I can remember." The confession, spoken so plainly in the gray light of his apartment, seemed to stun him into stillness. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were trying to process a language he had only just learned. 10 years, he whispered, the words full of a dawning, heartbreaking comprehension. "Leo, why didn't you ever?" "Because of that," I said, gesturing to his anguished face. "Because I knew. I knew you didn't see me that way, and our friendship was too important to risk. I chose to have you in my life as a friend over the possibility of not having you at all." It was a simple, painful calculation. A wave of emotion washed over his face, regret, sorrow, and something else, something that looked like wonder. He finally seemed to understand the depth and breadth of it all, the secret history that had been running parallel to our own for so long. He reached out then, his hand hesitant, and laid it on my knee. His touch was not one of passion, but of contrition, of connection. It was an apology and a promise. "I'm so sorry," he said, and this time, the words didn't feel like a dismissal. They felt like an acknowledgement of all the time we had lost, of all the pain my silence must have cost me. I was so blind. "You weren't blind," I corrected him gently. "You were just looking in a different direction. And I was hiding." I covered his hand with my own, our fingers lacing together in a gesture that felt both new and anciently familiar. "Look, you're right. You don't know how to do this. And you know what? Neither do I. Not really. All I know is how to love you in secret. I have no idea how to do it out in the open. So maybe we can be lost together. Maybe we can figure it out." A fragile hope flickered in his tired eyes. "You'd be willing to do that? After I ran, you came back?" I said simply. "Or, well, I made you come back. The point is, you're here now. We're here. We can start from here." That conversation was the true beginning. It was the moment we laid the first stone of our new foundation, not on plausible deniability or unspoken needs, but on the solid ground of mutual confession. We didn't solve everything that day. There was no magical movie moment where all fear and uncertainty vanished. Instead, we made a simple, quiet pact. We would try. We would be honest. We would be patient with each other and with ourselves. The days and weeks that followed were a slow, careful navigation of this new landscape. It was awkward at times, a dance of two people learning new steps. There were moments of hesitation, of old habits warring with new intentions. But the defining characteristic of this new era was gentleness. We were gentle with each other's fears, gentle with the fragile, budding thing between us. The frantic energy that had defined his panic was replaced by a quiet, deliberate intentionality. The rituals we had before didn't disappear, they transformed. Movie nights on the couch were no longer a covert operation for comfort. Now, when he laid his head on my shoulder, it was an open, acknowledged gesture of affection. My hand would find his without a moment's hesitation, our fingers intertwining as a simple, declarative statement. The anxiety that had once thrummed beneath my skin was replaced by a deep, profound peace. I was no longer an observer of his rest. I was a participant in it. The open-door policy of my bedroom evolved as well. There was no more pretext of jet lag or insomnia. He just started staying. His toothbrush appeared in the holder next to mine, a silent but powerful symbol of his permanence. His suitcase from work trips would be unpacked into a drawer I had cleared for him. The first time we went to sleep in the same bed after our confrontation, it was with a sense of quiet reverence. He didn't just get into the bed. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. "Is this okay?" he asked, the same words he'd used on the couch weeks before. But this time they were not a question of tolerance, but a request for enthusiastic consent. "It's more than okay," I whispered back, and I reached out, tracing the faint scar above his eyebrow, a landmark I had only ever been able to appreciate from a distance. He leaned into my touch, a soft sigh escaping his lips, a sound of pure contentment. That night, we didn't just lie next to each other, two separate islands. He closed the distance between us, wrapping an arm around my waist and pulling me against his chest, tucking my head under his chin. I fell asleep to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my ear, the sound I had once been so afraid he would hear, now the rhythm of my own peace. I was finally home. We learned to talk. It sounds simple, but for two people who had built a friendship on a foundation of things left unsaid, it was a revelation. We talked about his fears, about the slow process of reconciling his new reality with his old identity. We talked about my years of silence, the ache of it, the loneliness. We were excavating our own history, carefully brushing the dust off of old memories and re-examining them in this new light. And with every honest conversation, the foundation beneath us grew stronger. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I found Julian in my kitchen, wearing an old t-shirt of mine, moving with a comfortable, easy grace that had been absent for so long. He was just standing there, watching the coffee drip into the pot, a small, genuine smile on his face. The sunlight streamed in, catching the gold in his eyes, and my photographer's brain screamed at me to grab my camera, to capture this perfect, fleeting moment of domestic bliss. But I didn't. I just leaned against the doorframe and watched him, content to let the moment exist for its own sake, for our sake. He turned and saw me, and his smile widened. It was the easy, brilliant smile that I had first fallen in love with, but now it was for me. It was all for me. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and full of sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to me, our fingers brushing. The casual touch sent a familiar, pleasant jolt through me, but it was no longer tinged with panic or uncertainty. It was just warmth. It was just us. We stood there in the sun-drenched kitchen, sipping our coffee in a comfortable, beautiful silence. The silence I had described to him on the couch. The silence that was not an absence of words, but a presence of understanding. The silence that said everything. It turns out that the most profound changes in your life don't always announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet question whispered in the dark, a question that gives you the chance to tear down the walls you've built and invite someone into the beautiful, messy, honest rooms of your heart. It's a terrifying thing to hand someone the key, to trust that they won't just walk away. But we didn't walk away. We stayed. We stayed, and in the quiet, gentle space we carved out for ourselves, we began to build a home. Not a place of wood and nails, but one made of shared silence and whispered truths and the breathtaking, ordinary peace of finally being known.